Hi, I'm Lisa. Welcome back to Biblical Reality Check. Today, I'm beginning a new series on the parables of Jesus. My goal with this series is simple it's to show that Jesus was not teaching religion or morality, he was teaching perception. He was teaching us how to see. His parables were maps of consciousness. And we're starting this series with the parable that unlocks all the others, the prodigal son. I'm beginning here because this parable is the master pattern, the psychological blueprint Jesus uses to reveal how the egoistic self collapses, how awakening happens, and how we return to the inner kingdom that has always been within us. Every other parable Jesus tells is, in some way, an echo of this one. The parable of the prodigal son is so foundational because it covers all these truths in a short story. However, we shouldn't interpret the story as one about two ancient brothers and their father, but rather as a psychological map of the human mind. Think of it as a story about you, your consciousness, your constructed ego self, your moments of collapse, and your moments of awakening. Let's begin with a short summary of the parable, and then we'll walk through each section of the story because Jesus tells it in a way that mirrors the entire journey of our human consciousness. The parable of the prodigal son is found in Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. Jesus tells of a younger son who demands his inheritance early and leaves home. He wastes it all in reckless living, and after a severe famine strikes the land, he becomes destitute and hires himself out to feed pigs. He becomes so hungry that he longs to eat the pods the pigs are eating, yet no one gives him anything. After a while, he comes to his senses and remembers that even his father's servants had food to spare. So, in humility, he decides to return home. While he's still a ways off, his father runs to meet him. His father embraces him and has a celebration for him because his lost son has come back home. The older brother, however, resents the celebration, feeling his own obedience has gone unnoticed. The father reassures him that he is always valued, but that rejoicing is right because, quote, this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. Jesus begins the story with an important detail. The younger son asks his father for his share of the inheritance. In the ancient world, this was unthinkable. Inheritance was only given after the father died. To ask for it early was essentially to say, I want what you can give me, but I don't want you. To understand this, you have to understand what I have been calling the false constructed self of ego. By false self, I mean a self understanding that's built on separation rather than belonging. It's the part of us that says, I must secure myself, I must prove my worth, I must take what I need before it's taken from me, and so on. The younger son's request is not simply a desire for resources, it reflects a specific breakdown in relationship. He seeks the benefits of the system he comes from while disengaging from the relational structure that gives those benefits stability and meaning. In diagnostic terms, this mirrors a common pattern in ego consciousness, the attempt to exercise autonomy, agency, and self direction while disconnecting from the underlying universal laws that organize those functions. The individual tries to operate on borrowed capacities, energy, coherence, identity, without remaining aligned with the principles that make those capacities viable. The Father's response is consistent with how consciousness operates. Reality doesn't override a person's chosen trajectory. It does not force integration or alignment. It allows the individual to pursue a path, even when that path is organized around avoidance, distortion, or disconnection from what is real. The younger son takes the inheritance, gathers everything he has, and leaves for a distant country. The son's leaving is indicative of the moment every human being experiences when ego says, I know better. I don't need guidance. I can define reality on my own terms. After spending his inheritance on reckless living, the story tells us a famine hits. He becomes destitute and hires himself out to feed pigs. So hungry that he longs to eat the pods the pigs are eating, yet no one gives him anything, he comes to his senses and remembers that even his father's servants have food to spare. This is a turning point in the narrative. Longing to fill his stomach with the pods the pigs were eating is symbolic of the moment of ego starvation, when the illusions we feed on no longer sustain us. Up until that point, the prodigal believed the pods of the world, pleasure, escape, self indulgence, would satisfy him. They didn't, because a self built on separation has a fatal problem. It has no renewable source, so it must constantly consume. Just think of what the false ego self uses as fuel: approval, pleasure, success, control, money, experiences, even religious performance. But none of these can sustain identity. They can only stimulate it temporarily. So the false self spends faster than it can replenish, consumes without rest, escalates because yesterday's fix no longer works, and mistakes intensity for life. This is why the text says the son squandered everything, not because he partied, but because his mode of existence was unsustainable. A life cut off from its source will always feel like it's running on empty. And then Jesus gives the most important line in the entire parable. He came to his senses. Coming to his senses is the moment the prodigal sees the deeper truth of his condition, which is not his lack of food or shelter, but himself. By the time the famine comes, he doesn't just lack resources. He lacks dignity, direction, and memory of who he is. That's what the false self ultimately consumes. Joy turns into hunger, freedom turns into compulsion, independence turns into slavery, and desire turns into need. The tragedy isn't that he spent too much, it's that he tried to live from what cannot give life. He recognizes the lies he's been feeding on. He realizes that the world he trusted cannot sustain him. And so he decides to return home after remembering that even his father's servants have food to spare. That's because the father's house operates by a different logic: abundance rather than scarcity, shared life rather than hoarded goods, identity given rather than achieved. The true self, the self rooted in belonging, doesn't need to burn fuel to exist. It receives, it rests, it shares, it endures. That's why the moment of repentance begins not with shame, but with remembering. On his way home, the prodigal prepares a speech he's going to tell his father when he gets there. He's going to say, I am no longer worthy. I will be a servant and earn my way back. However, he never gets the chance to give his speech because while he was still a long way off, his father sees him and runs to him. The father doesn't wait for worthiness. He doesn't wait for an apology. He doesn't wait for the son to explain himself. He runs to him and embraces him. This is the inner kingdom. This is what awakening feels like. The father throws a feast to celebrate. The household rejoices, and the son is restored. The story could have ended there, but the older brother who stayed home is the one more of us can relate to. When he hears of his brother's celebration, he's angry and refuses to enter into it. He tells his father that he's worked all these years, never disobeyed, faithfully carried out his duties, and yet his father never rewarded him with a celebration. The older son's ego is built on comparison, resentment, scorekeeping, moral superiority, and conditional love. He is physically close to his father, but psychologically he's far away. His response indicates an ego that follows the rules but never awakens. When the father responds by telling him, "You are always with me and everything I have is yours," he is not talking about the inheritance. He is talking about consciousness. The kingdom was always available to the older brother, but his ego kept him outside the celebration. This is the tragedy of the older brother. He never left home, but he never came home either. In brief, the parable of the prodigal son is not about morality. It's about perception. It's about the moment you realize you've been living from a constructed identity that cannot sustain itself. It's about the collapse of the defended ego self and the return to the unconstructed self that was never separate to begin with. And when you summarize the parable as Jesus tells it, the pattern becomes clear. The younger son represents ego collapse. The father represents truth consciousness. The older brother represents ego resistance. The famine represents the lack of sustenance that the ego self provides. The running father represents the collapse of the distance between a truth consciousness and an ego consciousness. The celebration represents the joy and fulfillment of awakening to the truth of one's existence. The pig pen represents the illusions of ego. And this is why I began the series with the parable of the prodigal son, because every parable that follows is another angle on the same truth. You are not the constructed ego self. You are not the story you built. You are not the identity you've been defending. You are the awareness that comes to itself. You are the one who returns. You are the one who is never actually separate. You are the one called to remember. This is the heart of Jesus' teaching. This is the path of inner transformation. This is the work of perception. So, having seen in the prodigal son how one person comes to his senses and returns to the inner kingdom, in our next video, we'll explore what kind of inner soil allows that awakening to last, and what kind of soil keeps us stuck in the same patterns. And for those who want to go deeper into the mechanics behind that transformation, I've also created a short companion piece to this video on the 8 universal laws at work in the parable of the prodigal son. Those 8 laws are the energetic principles that make the return home possible, because Jesus isn't just telling us that we can come home. He's showing us what kind of consciousness can stay there. Thanks for watching.